Hello, church. This is our weekly edition of Continuing the Conversation. We've been on Sunday mornings just looking at some significant theological ideas and what it means for us and followers of Jesus, and where we fall on some of these thoughts, not to try and tell you how to think, but just to have conversation. And so these moments for us are just sort of continuing, that same thing of thinking through some of these ideas, and sometimes it's just off the cuff, which might be right now.
It will be.
Yeah, well, it was a fun Sunday. I mean, It was so cool to hear Miranda's testimony, about her desire to have a relationship with Jesus. Mm-hmm. And the reason, what she said was, well, I saw my husband's relationship with Jesus. And so it's like, I think for me at least, this series, it's less about apologetics, well, let me tell you why you need to believe in Jesus, and more, let me show you what believing in Jesus does in your life, and what it does in the world, and what it does in your family. And so it was so cool just she's reflecting that so beautifully. I think that's the hope in this series, is we talk about what we believe. It's practical, it's relational, it's how does it change, our lives. So yeah, I'm curious, both your community groups got together, what were some of the things that came up in your community groups that you started to continue the conversation on from Sunday morning?
I think our group, we just continued the conversation that we had started last week about the Trinity, and then trying to think about, how is Jesus fully divine, fully human? When exactly did he become human? That was a topic of our
December 25th,
yes,
080.
Right. With in the stable. Yeah. So I think that was part of our conversation. But then as you were talking about, the relational aspect of it, and maybe not so apologetic at the same time, for me, I'm just recognizing that as we go through what we do believe, it helps us to understand when we hear something that's different. Yeah. That is like, I don't think that's quite Christian, or quite the way that Christians would describe something, would describe the Trinity, would describe, who Jesus is. So I think in some ways it's helping us, just shaping us and helping us to recognize when we hear something that isn't maybe orthodox, to recognize that. So I think it's helpful in that way. Yeah. Because it's all around, there's different beliefs all around in the culture, and so how do we discern what is orthodox? Yeah. And the other thing we talked about in our group was just some of our conversations in general, not on camera, about the dogma or orthodox, and then the doctrine, and then the non-essentials, and how sometimes we're ended up putting things on the line. And so what does that look like? What's really orthodox? What's dogma? So we had some good discussion about that.
Yeah, I think that is probably the part of this series, is that you can hear the difference, especially with Jesus. That what the Christian faith has believed about who Jesus is unique. It is distinctive from all other religions. Right. I had a conversation with someone after worship on Sunday that was like, so how do we have conversations with people if they're like, well, I think Jesus, if they answer the question, who do you say Jesus is? And they say, well, he's a prophet, like Muslims would say, well, he's a prophet. Well, then, it's not just, oh, good, I'm glad you think something about Jesus. It's like, well, no, how do you have those follow-up conversations? And a lot of that's relational. A lot of it's dependent on people's cultures. I will say, there's a book called Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus by Nabil Qureshi, I think. That's a really helpful guide. It's from someone who was a Muslim and then became a follower of Jesus. So I think if that's an area, if you have Muslim friends, or you're having conversations with people who are Muslim and you want to know more about that, I think that would be a good resource. But yeah, first and foremost, can you hear the dissonance? Can you hear that? Well, that's an off note. That's not quite what what Christianity has said about Jesus, that would be the first step. It's not quite in alignment. It's not orthodox. It's, you know, kind of misaligned. But yeah, what about you, Garrett? What were some of the things?
Well, we sort of went down the firstborn. That topic came up, the firstborn, and I was mentioning to you today, like that the book that you and I were looking at, Karen. I don't think you've seen it yet. It's a holiness book, but the author, what's her name?
Diane Leclerc.
She reminds us in that book, like we want to separate out. Well, here's God, and then there's Jesus, and there's the Holy Spirit, and that idea of the firstborn, like that sends us down the path. It can send you down the path of Jesus being created, right?
Right.
But this idea that no, there's God and Jesus is God, right? And Holy Spirit is God, like that same substance, that homoousios.
Ooh,
right?
Yeah, nice.
And that, you know, I think can be a sticking point for folks when we talk about Jesus and that firstborn idea of, okay, well, he was a created being, but no, like from the beginning, Jesus was God. So then, you know, the death and resurrection then being us invited into a relationship with God, the creator of all things. And so that was a conversation, a path that we went down.
Yeah, that's cool. And that's very much the trajectory of Colossians 2 or Colossians 1 that we looked at, like Philippians 2 and that hymn, Hebrews 1 as well, which is, if you did the list, like our community group just did the list and wrote all these things about Jesus, which was really fun. I mean, again, we're just dealing with metaphors, and so it's still like, well, who is this Jesus? Well, all we have is language and metaphor, but yeah, that he is above and over and preeminent and before all of these things. You know, the word that was there at the beginning, the firstborn, you know, over all creation, that he is the image of the invisible God, I think, you know, is really where right from the beginning, the New Testament church, you know, wants you to really they realize that was the core work that they had to do, and even then with the creeds, you know, 300 years later, and then the Apostles' Creed 500 years later, like they spent 500 years trying to encapsulate this because they knew how central it was to the Christian faith. There's a book, if this is interesting you and you want to read more, this is a book, it's called What Christians Ought to Believe by Michael Bird. And he bases, you know, his book kind of structures around the Apostles' Creed. But what I like about it is it's very accessible. So, you know, there's tons of books and there's tons of textbooks and there's tons of academic works about all of these things. But you can read this and he summarizes and he gives you accessible, you know, language and to read things like this. And then if you want to nerd out on something, you know, he gives you ways to do that. But
and what I've appreciated, I know with both of you at the end of your teaching times on Sundays have come to that question of so what, right? So let's bring it back to the practical. And that Leclerc, I appreciate it. And you've probably heard this term or this idea before, but like the creeds, it's so easy to make it about an intellectual assent, right? I'm going to come to a place where I know God, who God is. But I appreciate that both of you and these authors bring us back to, but now what does that mean and how we live our life? Because that's what the creeds were about. It was about, this is who God is, and how do we now live this out, which I think is really helpful.
Yeah, the creeds are really the story that we're saying, this is the story I'm living. This is the meta story, the big picture that I'm living into. And really that kind of is what belief is. Like, when I believe something, it's like I believe that all my actions and all the ways I'm spending my time and energy are living into this story. And that's why Paul, you know, in 1 Corinthians 15 is like, if Jesus was not raised from the dead, like the word would be pity.
We of all men are most miserable.
This is a waste of time.
And those are huge words, right? Like that's not to be taken lightly. Like if it didn't happen, then this whole thing is a waste.
Right. So so I think that's great. Okay. Well, you know, we want to keep having these conversations and we're open to questions. You know, I think it'll get fun as we start to move out towards Orthodox as well. There's our timer. You know, that will hopefully continue to, I'll say, provoke good conversation. and just
Yeah.
wrestling with these things. So thanks for joining us on the journey, and we'll see you next week.
All right.
All right,
See you.
bye.
Bye.